Thank you. Good afternoon. It's 3 o'clock and I'm calling the November ZBA meeting of Sagaponic to order. The first order of business, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, we got the minutes for the October 7th meeting. Everybody have a chance to review them? Okay, subject to some minor typos that are being corrected, I'll accept a motion to accept those minutes and put them in the motion. I'll second that motion. All in favor? Okay, carried. So the minutes are
Sorry?
passed.
Yep,
Hello?
I'm ready.
Okay, somebody on Zoom, please mute your microphone. Unless you want to speak later on, we'll give you the opportunity. Anybody who's here.
Okay, there we go.
Thanks. Okay, so the first item of old business is the application of 110 Sand Dune LLC. We heard this application last month and continued it over to this month. And I don't know whether we have further direct testimony that you want to thank David.
Good afternoon. David Gilmore, Greenwood, Florida, 110 Sand Dune. This is really a simple case factually. The applicant's looking for the variance necessary to raise the house to meet FEMA requirements. Where the challenge comes in is you have conflicting parts of your code that require you to consider those that are in contract or in conflict. The variances, while seemingly large, are the minimum necessary that we need to do to raise the house. Recent weather events, certainly in Florida, and the town's adoption, town of East Hampton's adoption of the coastal assessment and the resiliency plan have dictated that we do this now. Since the last meeting, we received a memo of law from the neighbors, and it's clear to me that these neighbors don't get along and don't agree on much. One thing that I think, after reading the memo of law, that I can agree on is the line that they put in their memo of law, which says, "It's understood that variances are regularly and appropriately granted for 3 stories in FEMA zones." I agree with that. It's regularly done. Town of Southampton, I have some cases for you, the village of Southampton and the town of East Hampton. This argument that was raised was part of an argument where the objecting says that our house is 4 stories. It's simply not. There's several places of proof for that. First, there are 2 COs that were granted by the town of Southampton. There are 4 certificates of compliance issued by the town of Southampton. And then there are 2 certificates of compliance that were issued by the village of Sagaponic. Those documents, along with the interpretation by your building inspector, who I believe is here, and can corroborate this, the house is currently 2 stories. The additional story is where the enclosure of the elevator is on the ground floor. It's a 3-story house. The second argument that they make, and a lot of it, some of their arguments are legal in nature. I have a memo that's a reply memo to theirs to submit. So I don't want to get into legal arguments because I think that's not a great use of your time. But one of the second arguments that I have to take objection to is that the objectant says that the decision in 1145 Sag Main precludes a granting of the variance here. And it appears that the objectant didn't read the decision in the application of Petrillo, because in that, this board says it is not appropriate to consider 1145 Sag Main as part of the same neighborhood as the subject property. Another claim in this memo of law is that the pyramid was not measured from the correct location. And the height wasn't measured from the correct location. Again, again, it appears that the objected has used the wrong place to measure. They say in their papers that it's the incorrect location because it didn't start at existing natural grade. Well, your code for VE property says it starts at base flood elevation. In any event, the building inspector is here, and again, can provide you an interpretation. We went through this process during the application process, and he's given us a turn down letter, and that turn down letter provided an interpretation. Another claim that was made is that the side yard setbacks have increased vis-a-vis our application to raise the structure. Again, we're raising it, we're getting no closer to the sidelines. The basis of that assertion was a case that came out of the town of Islip that said that a second story couldn't be added to a structure. We're not in Islip. We're in Sagaponic. Your code is different. When we look at these cases, we have to understand the underlying zoning code that the courts are applying to a property. And once you look at the difference between Sagaponic and Islip, you'll understand that Islip specifically says that anything new on a non-conforming location, a non-conforming building on a conforming use on a non-conforming lot cannot be expanded unless it meets current zoning requirements. That's not the case in Sagaponic. Finally, and I'd like to reserve some time because I think I need to respond, but I was intrigued by a remark that the chairman made that the code already provides an accommodation for height, so that the maximum height is 32, but if you're in the flood zones, it goes to 40, so the maximum height is 40. So I took a look at FEMA's maps, at the COs, the building permits, and the village code. And in 1988, this property was in a split zone under FEMA. It was an AE10, DE11. In 2009, the zone was changed to DE17. The COs for this property and the regulations which govern the building permit, the most recent building permits were in June of 2009, and that's when the first and second editions were, the CO for the first and second editions were issued. So it's about 3 months after the issuance of the CO that FEMA came and changed the regulations. And I think that highlights why we're here today. The village, in its wisdom, accommodated the zones, but I don't know that law has been accommodated to meet the increase that has occurred in the FEMA zone. That's all for now. I guess, again, I'd like to reserve some time to respond to the objections, council, but we'd ask that you grant the merits.
Absolutely. So you've been invited to rebut.
Good afternoon, Chairman and members of the board. Nika Strunk, 37 Windmill Lane, Southampton, New York, for Anthony and Cynthia Petrello, who own property directly to the east of the subject site at 108 Sand Dune Court and several other lots in the immediate vicinity. I did submit a memorandum of law, and I thank the board for allowing me a few extra days to do so. I thought that both sides were required to submit their submissions within a week prior to the hearing date, so I was surprised to hear that a reply memo was on its way. Didn't think that's how we had set this up. But in any case, I'm not going to regurgitate the entire memo, but I would like to make a few points. The first point that I made in the memo is that Ms. Lutnick is taking inconsistent positions before this board. She was here for 4 or 5 public hearings in which she objected to the size and height of my client's proposed house. And then comes now with a far, far, far greater request for size and height than the one that she objected to. The doctrine of judicial estoppel applies. I looked for a case to see if it applies before zoning boards of appeals. I'm sure that would be a question for you and for your counsel. I didn't find any, but I believe that since this is a quasi judicial board, that doctrine should at least be considered. It's a key fundamental principle that when a party comes before a quasi judicial making board, that they are not required, they're not allowed to turn around and then, even a few months later in this case, take a fully contrary position. That just is not allowed. Again, I want to emphasize that this is a massive increase in the degree of nonconformity which the code proscribes. As far as the number of stories, it's incomprehensible to me that this is considered a 3-story house. Jim McMullen is here. We were speaking this morning. We both looked at the plans very carefully. It's just like my client's proposed house in that it has a ground level with a space for parking and a vestibule and an elevator. And then on top of that, it has additional stories. On top of that, my clients had 2 additional stories. On top of this, this applicant has 3 additional stories. And there's 4 levels of floor plans submitted. There's an elevator, which it must have 4 stops. I mean, I think that the applicant should tell the board how many stops this proposed elevator is going to make. It has to be 4 to reach all of the floors that are proposed. So, and as I outlined in my memo, their plan A104 is labeled ground floor plan. A105 is labeled lower level plan. A106 is labeled main floor plan, and A107 is labeled second floor plan. That's 4 stories. I don't know of any 4-story variance that this board has granted for a house. And I don't think there's been any discussion of alternatives for this 4 stories, which I think would be really extraordinary if this board were to approve it. It would be completely unprecedented, and I see no justification for it. Getting to the height variance, I talked about this at the last hearing. It's far greater than the one that the Petrellos sought successfully for 2 feet 4 inches. We explored alternatives by seeking a FEMA line of map adjustment, which we received. That ensured that we asked for the minimum required variance. That hasn't been done here. Mr. Gilmartin said, and I did not know this until he said this, but the information is that when Ms. Lutnick purchased, which I believe was in 2006, the property was in a VE zone, a VE11 zone. So she purchased a house knowing that it did not meet FEMA requirements. And she did subsequent renovations to it knowing that it did not meet FEMA requirements. The 1145 Sag Main Street property and that decision, whether it was considered the same neighborhood for the purpose of a floor area analysis, I think that this board's decision, which I attached to my memo, made very clear that if the 1145 Sag Main variance, which was less, height variance, which was less, had been granted, it would tower over adjacent houses on Sand Dune Court. So this board considered that neighborhood in that context, and that has to be, that can't be thrown away. That has to be taken into account here. In addition to the size of the parcel there, which was 8 times larger than the size of this parcel, the pyramid variance, I will defer to Mr. McMullen about his firm's pyramid analysis. But it's certainly, not only do we have a pyramid volume that's out of compliance in this proposed house, we have a volume that's out of compliance with setback. And it's a huge volume. This is a huge volume. According to our architect's calculations, it's 47,245 cubic feet. That hasn't been addressed, I believe, by the applicant. As far as the islip case, it's not just islip that considers an increase in the degree of nonconformity when a structure that doesn't meet a setback is raised or added to on top. I believe this very board has found that to be the case before in, among other applications, the application of 122 Sand Dune Court, which is the very next property. There was a colloquy. I read the testimony, the transcript of the testimony, where Mr. Tillwell made very clear that if you are raising the house, you're increasing the degree of nonconformity if it does not already meet the required setbacks. And that requires a variance. So that has not been analyzed at all. And I think that's absolutely required. There's a request for a 47% increase in gross floor area. My client sought a overall 32% increase in gross floor area, and that was denied. I also can include the point about the code's 125-foot dune crest setback. I understand we discussed this last time, and there was a question as to whether the proposed raised house would meet the definition of a replacement building. I contacted your counsel. We didn't connect about any resolution of that issue, but there is no definition in the code that I could find of what a replacement building or structure is. And the application itself here refers to the rebuilding of the house. I think it should be required to meet the 125-foot dune crest setback under these circumstances. And even if it doesn't, even if that doesn't happen, it's already non-conforming as to that setback. And again, on the same principle, by raising it, the degree of non-conformity is increased. So those are the points. I don't believe they've been addressed by the applicant in any satisfactory way. I would like to ask, just a couple more quick things. The master bedroom, I forget the square footage that was given the last time we were here, but it's certainly very large, has a very large bathroom. There hasn't been any, this project could be made conforming if the master bedroom were relocated somewhere within the existing framework of the house. That would make the height far less, significant, the height variance far less significant. Is there a place within this house where the master bedroom can be relocated if they are going to raise it up so high? I don't think that option has been explored at all. And there's I'd like Jim McMullen to just speak briefly, because he's also looked at the plans in detail. And we do have one question about whether there's an area above the garage that may need to be counted as roofed accessory, and I don't know if we don't know if it has been. So I would like Jim to speak to that, if he would. Thanks.
Good afternoon. This question is more of just a clarification and maybe.
For the record, introduce yourself.
Sure. Jim McMullen from Fleetwood McMullen Architects out of East Hampton. Like I said, this is more of a clarification question. There is an area where the garage on the original structure was on the ground floor. And when they raised it up, that garage stayed on the ground floor, obviously, but it created a space, like a deck area above that is covered by decking or porch on the third floor, or what they call as the living area. And I was wondering, is that calculated in the accessory roofed structure?
So let me see if I understand what you're saying. So by raising the structure and leaving the garage on the ground floor, they created effectively an 8 or so foot space, a gap between the new roof decking and the top of the garage.
Yes.
What is that space?
Yes, there is roof there, and it is connected to the deck that's.
And there was no enclosure in the plans, no
No,
enclosure.
it's open air.
So it's a double height, basically, but it's an empty space above the garage up to the new deck.
Yeah, so instead of the old house, the deck came over the garage. Now, when it's been lifted, there is still that space, which is the roof of the garage now, but it's still underneath the deck that was originally on the garage.
John, is that something that you can opine on now? You want to think about that, or?
I'd have to review the plan, but from what I can tell, the working surface of the roof is, the surface of the roof is not a walking surface. They have taken into account the wraparound deck, and they have taken into account the area above it that's below the next level of walk-around deck. As far as I saw, all areas of roofed area that could be considered part of the floor area ratio were taken into account.
Thank you.
David, you want to return to the podium?
Sure. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but we have our architect here on Zoom who can opine to that. Andres, if they're available.
No, what Mr. Woodsman said is correct. It's a railinged off, non-habitable roof of the garage.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of rebuttal points. The argument that there are inconsistent positions here is really undermined by the fact of the basic nature of both applications. The Petrello application was for a structure that was going to be built. It's proposed, it's not there. The 110 sand dune is to raise an existing structure. It makes them different. So there's no, that estoppel argument doesn't apply anyway. I think it's most, and we argue that in our papers, but I think it's very easily understood that they're two very different applications. So while you have something that's proposed, a vacant piece of property, you can always meet zoning. You just would have to reduce the size or whatever is creating the nonconformity. Here, we're raising what is an existing structure. And I think that point is lost on much of the prior presentation. When you talk about size, right? The size, the FAR exists. It's what exists today. We're not adding anything to it. It's just being raised. And that's what, with a quirk in the code requires us to come and ask for that relief. The 4 stories, it's clear to me that it's 3 stories. I think it's clear to your building inspector. I think there's just some confusion on the other side, which, you can ask Mr. Woodsman to come up and give you an interpretation, but, I just don't get it. As far as the MAC adjustment, the reason for this, and it's got to be abundantly clear from our presentation, is that this is a safety matter to 110 sand dune. And we talked about the events that happened in Florida. We talked about Mrs. Lutnick's background and what she does for a living and going to these emergency situations and seeing them. We talked about the East Hampton Coastal Resiliency Plan and what they anticipate coming, and we're reacting to that. We don't intend to go any lower than what FEMA tells us is safe. We see the trend here that it's rising. This is on the ocean. If you look at the next section of FEMA, I think we're looking at 20 feet there. It goes from 17, 18 to 20, and that's the trend. We're not interested in making this lower and putting it in harm's way. There was a quote about what Mr. McMullen presented to the board, and I believe it's this document. From the outset, I would note that it appears the pyramid law is not measured from the property lines, which is necessary to do. We talked about that it wasn't, the height wasn't measured properly. This is not stamped, and on it, it says not to scale. So how can we make calculations with something that's not to scale? So if I were the board, I'd reject anything on this, as I believe that it's inaccurate. And finally, I'd just like to submit some documents, one of which is our reply memorandum. Should I give just the bulk to someone, or should I give them out individually?
In response to Nika's comment before about the procedure, we had asked that submissions be delivered to us at least a week before. We did grant her a little bit of an extension of time for extenuating circumstances to deliver it. It wasn't contemplated that you would have an opportunity to reply effectively after having reviewed her documents and given them to us. But in fairness, neither one of you was required to submit supplementary documents, and both of you could have submitted documents when you walked in the door today. We were merely asking as a courtesy that we got it in sufficient time to review it before today, in the hope that we could close the hearing based upon the thorough review of all materials. In view of your submitting this reply today, I think in fairness, I'll give Nika an opportunity to review it. You can take a quick look at it today, listen to what he has to say. But if you feel you need an opportunity to respond to this late delivered documents, then I would suggest that we probably would at least hold the hearing open for additional written submissions, if not oral testimony, in fairness.
Okay, but what my understanding was that we were supposed to talk and schedule this. I got a request from the village on Monday to extend her time. I didn't hear anything in between. So I didn't know that this was happening.
I'm not objecting to your submission today. I think.
Well, you called it late.
Sorry?
You called it late.
No. Well, late meaning in time for us to have an opportunity to review it before making a decision at this meeting. I'm merely saying our objective, first of all, again, I've said this many times, I'll say it again. This is not an adversarial proceeding between a proponent, an applicant for a variance, and a neighbor who may be opposing. This is an application for a variance where the decision is by the Zoning Board of Appeals of Sagaponack on behalf of the village of Sagaponack and not on a litigant. I do appreciate the at least quasi, if not actual adversarial nature of these hearings, because it does a great deal to inform us and enable us to make an informed decision. You mentioned earlier this afternoon that you didn't want to burden us with the legal issues, but that's what we're here for. This is a quasi-judicial administrative agency, but we are bound by the law. And the legal points that have been raised, as I've been furiously making notes here, are sufficient to perhaps do an entire law school exam. Is this a replacement or is it a reconstruction? Is there an estoppel or isn't there an estoppel? Is this a 4-story building or is it not a 4-story building? All of which are very interesting and germane issues and are legal. So I am interested in hearing your points of view. And I want to make sure that we don't arbitrarily cut off useful information that would enable us to make a correct decision, or one that we believe is correct at least. So I don't object to your having delivered this today. I'm merely making the point that in fairness to us, as well as to the other party here who is opposing the application, I would think that we will at least hold the hearing open for additional written submissions, whether or not we continue the oral part of the hearing.
Just, I would say this is a reply. I don't raise any new issues in it.
Okay.
My understanding of what was going to happen was different, and I thought that we would, my adversary and I would talk about when we would put things in, and I was surprised to see the request. I didn't object to it. But, you know, in the sense of fairness, we should have the opportunity to apply. Second thing I want to put in is we referenced Biden's Building a Better America in our last submission, but I don't think that it made it into the submission. So I just want to make sure that you had a copy of that.
By the way, I will take quasi judicial notice and thank you for that remarkable submission of the CARP, the East Hampton. This is an extraordinarily informative and interesting piece of work that I was not familiar with, and I thought it was very, very interesting. I don't know how much of it is germane to our particular hearing, but it was of great interest. Thank you.
The next thing I want to give you, and I just have one copy, are some decisions from the town of Southampton over the grant variances to properties to meet FEMA. And if I could hand up copies of the CO and the FEMA map that I referred to. So it's going to be the series of COs and the FEMA map that show us the change in the FEMA rates. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, there's one copy of the ZBA cases from Southampton City passing it down, like there's just one
These are
copy.
all, yeah.
They're all.
Oh, I
These
see.
are several,
One
yeah,
set.
yeah,
I got
it-
you.
it's one group of
Ah, yeah,
all
yeah,
the
yeah.
variances.
Okay.
Past-
All right, so we will hold this for the moment.
So again, we didn't cover any new ground. We asked that we grant the variance for safety's sake. There's no better benefit I can think of for a zoning board of appeals to consider than the safety and welfare of the occupants of the house itself and the neighborhood. And there's absolutely no detriment here. In fact, I think it's a benefit to have this structure made flood-proof. We ask you to grant the variance.
So two things. The submissions that you just made to us now, has Nika received copies of those or
She will.
she will? Okay.
Can I get them digitally? Oh, nothing for me, thank you.
Okay.
Can I get them digitally, just so I make sure that I have everything?
Can you get her digital copy?
Yeah, I can scan it.
Okay.
Thank
So in addition to the general comment I made before about our role here is not deciding between two litigants, but rendering a decision based upon the code and justification under the standards that we're supposed to apply and determining whether to grant variances or not. I also want to point out something that I did expressly say last month, and I'll just say it again. And that is, as a matter of fact, I think I actually took it right from the minutes. Because it was important point where there was a suggestion of an all or nothing, is that we either allow residents of the village to drown because we won't grant them relief, or we grant them relief which exceeds our zoning requirements beyond that which is justified. The request for the variance is to exceed the 40-foot height that was the bonus that was granted under the code for this district by almost double. And the point is not whether people should be allowed to elevate their homes to protect them for FEMA purposes, but whether they should be permitted to exceed the already augmented height that the village recognizes in order to allow for that protection. Now, you have made an argument today that wasn't last month about the change in the maps, which I want to hear about because that may be relevant. But the further point that I made last month was that if this is a general problem affecting our beachfront, that the bonus that's permitted in the already zoned area for the beachfront to grant people that accommodation is insufficient, then I would suggest that the trustees should consider an amendment to the zoning code that would be uniform across the beachfronts, rather than the ZBA sitting here and doing what I characterized, perhaps it isn't technically, but spot zoning, by granting variances as applications come up from time to time, and having potential inconsistencies that people may find objectionable. In that same vein, I go back to the legal argument that's been persistently made about estoppel and res judicata, which I think is entirely off the mark. First of all, there's no res judicata because it's not the same property, it's not the same issue. I don't even believe that it's an estoppel because, for one reason that you pointed out, but for another, this isn't a litigation. This is not, neither one of you is a party to a litigation who has made an argument that has had a determination made whereby they would be estopped. There may be an equitable argument that someone who argues against something should not be heard to come in support of something in a different situation as it being an inconsistent position. But even if it is an inconsistent position, it is not legally barred because it's not an inconsistent position with respect to the same issue. If she had come in and argued that the variance that was granted in a particular case should not be granted, having supported it previously, that would be barred. It's an estoppel and inconsistent, but this is a different property. And the very purpose of the ZBA, Zoning Board of Appeals, is to render relief in specific cases as exceptions to a general rule. Now, if estoppel were to apply, then if we granted one variance, whether it was 2 feet or 7 feet or 11 feet, we'd be stuck. We'd be bound by that for all of the other properties, and there'd be no point in having a ZBA, because once we had decided an issue, we would be stopped from changing our position. Each one of these properties is unique. That's the nature of real estate. It's the nature of variances. It's the nature of the Zoning Board of Appeals. So I don't buy any of the estoppel arguments here at all. I think we are hearing this case on its own merits. We can take notice of what other variances we have granted or haven't granted, and the differing circumstances, such as whether it's a new structure or an existing structure or expansion. But, and I don't know, we haven't had a chance to talk about the definition. I don't think there's a definition of a replacement. The closest that I can come to thinking about what's a replacement would be a substantial alteration, which requires, I think, 50% of the then fair market value of the property would constitute a substantial modification, which might be similar to the notion of whether it's a replacement property as opposed to a renovation. But either way, it seems to me, what do they call it in chess? A fork? Something where if this is a replacement structure, it's got to comply with the code and it would require a variance if it doesn't. If it's not a replacement structure and it is an alteration of an existing structure, since it is a non-conforming property, then the zoning code says you can't increase the degree of non-conformity. And there are substantial increases in a number of different non-conformities here, whether or not the mere elevation changes the sideline variance or not. So there are clearly increases in the degree of non-conformity which require our consideration. The 3 and 4 story issue is getting kind of troublesome also. I think this is semantics. I'm kind of annoyed at the concept of 3 stories or 4 stories because we have already said that whether we call it a story or not, the ground floor story below where the piles up to the FEMA level where the first floor begins does not count for our zoning purposes, whether we call it a story or not. So to argue whether it's 3 stories or 4 stories is not the point. The point is that there are 3 habitable stories, as far as I can tell, in the structure without counting the below FEMA level threshold. There's the first floor living area, there's a second floor, and there is a master suite, which is approximately 1,000 square feet up on what appears to me to be a 3rd habitable level. So I I don't really care whether we call it 3 stories or 4 stories. There are 3 habitable floors in the building right now, and one of those will be almost entirely above the already augmented maximum height. So I think we have to consider that. Okay, so the other issue that was mentioned too had to do with relocating the master bedroom. I also mentioned at our last session, I asked whether there had been any feasibility studies done to see whether there could be an alternate location, a relocation of that, what I'm calling a 3rd floor, the one that intrudes entirely into the prohibited space. It was suggested that the mechanical spaces take up space when you move up, and that they will take up area in the 1st floor. But there still is within that area on that floor, there could be a landward extension because this property doesn't come close to the front setback requirement. And even if it did, there could be a variance for a front yard setback. But there hasn't been any kind of a feasibility analysis. I mean, you acknowledge that one wasn't even done, that you asked and it was considered, but it was rejected. But there's no evidence that it was seriously considered. Whether this bedroom could be relocated onto either the 1st or 2nd habitable floors, either within the existing footprint of the structure or extending landward, where there does seem to be plenty of room, even perhaps on that deck, which doesn't count as GFA, over the garage. So I would like to hear more about whether there's any feasible alternative.
With respect to the stories, I don't know if it's appropriate, but this was an issue that we went through with the building inspector.
No, I understand, but I'm saying, but no one is challenging the non-counting empty space with breakaway walls in the garage, non-habitable space below the ground floor level.
It was not what I was referring to respectfully. What the stories were.
Yeah.
Mr. Woodsman and the architect went through prior to the turn down letter and this happening. And I think Mr. Woodsman can explain to you clearly that it's currently a 2-story house as it's CO, as it's situated. And we're just raising it, but I think he can clear that up for you.
Well, so that's why you produce the COs, I assume.
Right. I mean, the decision, the experts that have looked at this house have said it's 2 stories.
Well, are we bound by the COs which were issued in 1970s or whenever they were issued here, which I haven't had a chance to review at this point? Or are we making a new determination based upon the modification of the building as to what those?
I think the one issue though is that the turn down letter itself doesn't create sort of a jurisdictional basis for us to really discuss the whole story issue, because it's not one of the issues that's deemed to be in non-compliance with the village code.
Okay, so we're not challenging the fact that this is a 3-story structure where only a 2-story structure is permitted in the village. What we're saying is that there is de facto, whether or not legally recognized as such, a 3rd story which entirely intrudes into a prohibited space for which you're seeking a variance, which increases the degree of nonconformity and may not be necessary if there is a feasible alternative, which I haven't heard much about.
There's an existing 2-story house. We're raising it. The 3rd story, that we're asking for relief for is for the elevator that's going to be enclosed.
Your architect, not your architect, your consultant, Mr. Jackson, I believe it was, he's a FEMA expert, right? Yes. Acknowledged when he spoke to us last month that when he consults and advises clients, while he instructs them and advises them and counsels them how to comply with FEMA regulations and protect themselves, always advises them that they still have to comply with local zoning laws and other building code laws. So again, I come back to the issue of a feasible alternative. We never object. I can't speak for everyone. I never object. I am sympathetic to people wanting to protect their homes from environmental issues and take them out of harm's way. But that, it's not a bright line, yes or no. It is protect while at the same time accommodating. I also mentioned last month that the trend here seems to be everybody just wants to stick piles under their buildings and lift their existing snuggled in the dune homes and stick them up on piles up in the air. There are alternate solutions to protecting yourself and complying with FEMA without doing that. And there are numerous, and I think I mentioned the Bates Massey article about designing homes and reconstructing homes and modifying their structures in order to both protect them and bring them at least into closer compliance with the zoning regulations that exist, if not fully in compliance. This is merely just a lifting of an existing structure with an entire habitable space that exceeds the already augmented elevation that's permitted, which is hard to swallow.
Well, I mean, that's the tension that you have, right, between the zoning and flood-proofing a building.
No, it's not the tension. It's exactly, that's my point. You can flood-proof and still comply or bring yourself closer into compliance by not merely lifting an existing structure into the air. It can be modified. And I haven't heard anything. I mean, I visited the property, I went to see it, and I see that blue structure, that master bedroom. It's about 1,000 square feet, if I recall, between the bedroom, the bathroom, and the hallway that accommodates the elevator hallway there is about 1,000 square feet. That at least some of that could be relocated to one of the lower levels or added to an additional extension that extends landward as opposed to upward.
So what we're getting to is the benefit of the applicant, right? What you described is something that was considered, but relocating, rebuilding, redoing this is phenomenally expensive. Raising it is the, financially what can be done in this case.
What do you think this house is worth?
I have no idea what it's worth.
Well, we're talking about very expensive to modify it. It's going to be expensive to raise it. It's also an extremely expensive property. So as a percentage of the value of the property, how much would the additional cost be to modify it into closer compliance with the regulations?
I don't think that considers all of the information for a full analysis. But what about the owner's financial capability and what they can and can't do? I mean, that's got to come into it when you talk about a benefit to an applicant.
So I think the question I have goes back to that garage and what I would look at as being a large void of space there. And if we're talking about all these variances, why would we leave essentially a void of space that's not utilized, that could be utilized in a way that would bring the house into conformity? Like, that seems like that's quite a bit of area above that garage, and it just looks like pilings pass through it. From a design perspective, I don't know if there wouldn't be breakaway walls because it's not being used as habitable space. But when we're being asked to, I go to the beach every day, I look at that house every day, I'm very familiar with it. It is the tallest of that section, and it will be even taller. It's like staggeringly so when it's done. And when I see that big void of space there, I just can't reconcile it. Having that void of space when we're being asked to change everybody's view of a public space, which is the beach, where people gather, looking out at the ocean, which is the only thing we can't manage to destroy at the moment, and just taking the dunes and going upwards. Again, similar to Elliot, I'm sympathetic to people who have their homes and love their homes on the beach. But I think part of loving your home is also loving the community you're in. And so though we spoke about estoppel and the points of it, I think what Nika was kind of bringing up is the substance of somebody arguing vociferously one way and then completely coming around in a self-serving point of view. Even though that's not one of the things we look at here, I take exception to that. And I feel as a board completely played. And I take
really, like personally, I find that hard to swallow. We sat through hours of testimony and work with the Petrello's piece, and then to have this arrive 2 months later is like, wow. It's, maybe the timing is really bad, but it's really hard for me to reconcile that void and the position of the applicant on a previous application. We're human beings, and I know we're supposed to separate these
So
things.
we have a balancing of the equity that Marilee has just articulated. On the one hand, there appears to be perhaps a feasible alternative to avoid the encroachment. On the other hand, she finds it somewhat hypocritical that the person who is pushing you is a person who was basically taking the opposite position before, which I think I've said, I don't think they're legally stopped from doing. I think it's a little unseemly, perhaps, I would agree. But the neighbor on the other side, Edie Lutnick's brother, did protect his house. He raised his house. It's totally FEMA compliant. It's up there on piles, and it comes no higher than Edie's current house. And it's
Lower.
compliant. It's low. I mean, and it's totally in compliance with FEMA, totally protected, but it was modified. I think, I don't remember what was there before, but it wasn't just lifting the house. I believe it was substantially modified.
It was demolished.
It didn't-
Virtually
no,
demolished.
it was
The chicken coop on
sense.
sticks.
Yeah.
Okay, so it was completely demolished, but in this case, you don't have to demolish the house. You could just strip off that blue structure on the top, which is the third living area, and move it someplace else. My point being that someone was able to totally FEMA protect their home and still be in total compliance with the zoning code.
Are you talking about the property to the west?
Yeah.
I mean, that was demolished and then rebuilt.
Yeah, well,
But
and it was very expensive to do that. You're saying that you can't remove one room from on top of the building and put it next to the building because it would be very expensive. And now we have a guy who totally demolished and rebuilt the house to make it FEMA compliant.
But they're different people with different financial capabilities, one. Two, when I made that comment, the void space wasn't discussed. Let me just come back and I'll ask Anderson a minute about that void space, talk about that. But the race judicata issue, I think, and I understand what you're saying intellectually, but I think you have to see the differences.
Now, wait a
in the
minute. Are you
application.
talking about race judicata or estoppel? There is no possible application of race judicata.
The estoppel
Okay.
argument where,
Right.
where she argued, where Ms. Lutnick argued against the Petrello application, now is making this application. When you have a vacant piece of property and a blank slate, you can meet zoning. The 110 Sand Dune application, that's a legally existing structure with its FAR and with all of the benefits that come with the CO that have been issued. So I think there's a difference.
There is a difference. That's why estoppel is not relevant.
Right, but when we say, we're uncomfortable with that coming in, or it's unseemly, I think was the word that was used. I would say that the answer to that is, again, it was a vacant piece versus a piece that has existed for, it was like.
I think you're arguing against your interest. What I'm saying is that she's not legally stopped from challenging your application because she previously pursued her own client's application. But it is a bit unseemly that her client is now opposing a variance.
I thought you meant.
No.
That Ms. Lutnick was unseemly in bringing this application. I think that was.
I'm saying
Yeah,
the timing of this,
that was
the
the
timing
input.
of this application.
I understand the
Yeah,
irony of
no.
the chairman just raised.
No.
But I think we have to, remove the argument of what happened next door. This is a separate piece of property. It's its own application and consider it as thus. And the unseemly argument, I just, I find that hard to take because of the differences in the applications.
All right, I take your point. And what I was doing is trying to reverse the positions to see whether it would apply in the opposite circumstance. In the Petrello case, the height variance was actually granted, it wasn't denied. right? So there wouldn't be a contrary issue in granting a variance here. It would be granting a variance in both cases, though in magnitude they're different. If the variance had been denied for the 2-foot variance and is now being granted for a 12-foot variance, that creates a bigger problem, correct? Okay, so I just think that it's added an element of confusion and unnecessary issues in discussing estoppel, because I don't think that estoppel legally applies. We're looking at this application on its merits, whether it's being pursued by someone who previously opposed someone else's variance or not.
We
I
can raise the
understand
stop
the
ordinance.
No, what? Yeah, okay.
Andres, if you're available, can you talk about the void space that was raised and the challenges with it?
Sure. Well, firstly, we didn't want to add any more floor area than we needed to. And secondly, the existing home prior to any renovations that were done to this in the early 2000s, including the blue volume, the small area, which is the master bedroom now, existed prior. And the client previously there were 2 guest bedrooms downstairs, which all shared 1 bathroom. And for accessibility reasons, the elevator was put in, and then the master suite expanded to make it more feasible to be able to use the space. So to the point of moving the blue volume downstairs, it kind of goes back to the problem that existed prior, which was that the master bedroom was only accessible by stairs and also shared a bathroom with 2 other bedrooms.
Another bathroom could be installed. I mean, you wouldn't be adding additional GFA, you'd be relocating it within the structure or adjacent to the structure. If you move the blue box, the master bedroom, from its current location to a lower elevation, anywhere on the property, it would be the same GFA, it would just be relocated to a more compliant location. And could accommodate a bathroom. I think Marilee was merely pointing out that there is a void there, not necessarily that would be where you would want to put the master bedroom.
We'll address it. I think some challenges that come to mind is that it needs to be accessed by elevator, and I don't know if that means reconstructing the entire inside of the house, but we'll do an analysis and get back to the board.
You already answered a question that I was thinking about, but I think you already answered it. And I was just wondering, and maybe this is with the council as well. We've all acknowledged that an existing home may be desirable to raise it to FEMA standards, but it's not legally required. I was wondering whether a lesser rise that didn't go fully to the FEMA elevation might be a reasonable compromise that would afford reasonable protection for the property while still being closer to compliance with the zoning. You said that you think that the trend is upward and therefore we're not so inclined to take a lesser variance. So you answered the question before I asked it, but I just wanted to make clear that it was something on my mind, and I appreciate your insight on that.
I'd also say, I don't think you can pull a building permit without making the structure FEMA compliant.
Well, that's what I was wondering, whether is there any legal requirement if it's a,
It
Or
goes
only if-
into how much money is being spent. You use fair market value. Here in Sacramento, FEMA allows some flexibility in how they establish the numbers for substantial addition renovation, where you're required to come to FEMA height. We use the cost of square footage breakdown. We don't use fair market value because this fair market value on this house would be in the 25 million plus range. So given those budgets, you could do whatever the hell you want, not have to become FEMA compliant. So we go with a square foot multiplier, and we come up with a budget of what we would need to have as a threshold below and above. So you don't have to become FEMA compliant if you're below this, you're above, if you're above it, you have to become FEMA compliant, or the permits are non-starter.
that's very informative. And chapter 80 of the code actually does contemplate granting variances that would be lesser than are required within the coastal erosion zone. I assume that would be the same thing for,
Yes.
okay,
Excuse me, Elliot.
yes.
I had somebody, JJ Lando, wants to ask the board a question. Are we gonna save that for the end?
Hold on for 1 minute. Are you finished for the moment? You can come back again. Yeah, then we'll take a question.
Okay.
Have they-
Mr. Lando, could you unmute yourself and put on your video, please?
Hi. I'm starting my video right now, sorry. Unmuted, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You're the owner of 1245, 1145, I believe. Is that
I'm the
correct?
owner of 1145 Sag Main, and there are a couple issues before the board that I thought have come up in this hearing that I thought might be relevant, and I wanted to bring them up. First of all, Mr. Mizell, I appreciate your looking at the East Hampton plan. There have been a number of references to the quote credit granted to homes in flood zone on height. And I want to be clear, the way the height is calculated is a min function of A comma B. So a house that's in a VE 35 zone, for example, can be 5 feet tall. A house that is 35 feet above elevation on Lumber Lane can be 32 feet tall. That's an extreme example, but it's not a credit. It can be a credit between VE 0 and 8, because in that narrow range, the 32 feet wouldn't otherwise be conforming of total height space. So it's like you're starting at negative, but at any VE zone over 8, because there's a 40-foot hard cap to height, there is no bonus, there is no credit. It is only a debit of the 40-foot hard cap that comes into play before any 32-foot credit comes in. So there is no credit in the code for homes in flood zones. And that usage of terminology, I believe, is inaccurate for any house that isn't less than a VE8. That applies to almost every house on the coast of Sagaponack. So I just want to be clear that there's no bonus and no credit. That is just not factually correct. And that applies to all 3 parties that have been talking today. And another matter that came up, Mr. Mizell, you've referenced a couple times the concept of, well, we can just make this flood proof per this Bates-Massey plan. You know, I happen to have looked a lot into this. As you might imagine, in our planning, there is no way to do it, as I understand it. Anything with keeping a house within the flood zone is restricted by the cost that Mr. Woodsma referenced, how it's calculated. It cannot be done under that cap. And what you end up with is a situation where you're building a new home, which for, you know, with homes of these sizes that any of the 3 of us are talking about is, you know, can be a $20 million construction project and take 3 years, which is the same thing if you lost your house to a flood, you're building a new house. So that is not flood resiliency or a reasonable ask, in my opinion. I strongly believe there is no such solution to just quote flood proofing a house in a flood zone, as evidenced by the fact that there's tens of thousands of homes that are lifting up and putting on pilings. Exactly the thing that you didn't like, and I understand perfectly well why you don't like it, but I want to be clear that there's a reason why that's the solution.
Well, hang on a minute. I mean, first of all, your initial analysis about the so-called bonus or the credit was highly technical, and I'm going to have to read that to fully understand it because it just didn't all sink in. But I still believe that without going into the various flood zones and sizes of homes within the village of Sagaponack, you can build to a height of 40 feet if you were in that zone where otherwise you could only build to an elevation of 32 feet. So that.
No, the
Yeah.
calculation is the lesser of 40 feet or 32 feet of total height within the flood zone, lesser of. So as I said, if you're in a VE 35, I'm just taking an extreme example, you'd only be able to build a 5-foot house because the 40-foot credit would kick in
Yeah,
at
but
5 feet above.
in this zone, okay, so what would the height would be 40 feet in this particular zone based upon the FEMA level for this zone with a freeboard with the 19 feet required, plus the 2 feet of freeboard brings you to 21 feet. And then you have basically a 2-story house on top of that, brings you to 40 feet.
40 feet of feet above sea level, but like, for example, if you're at an elevation of 20 feet and you're just on Lumber Lane, you can build a 32-foot house. That's 51 feet above sea level. So you can build homes to above 40 feet above sea level, except when you're on the beach. It's a cap. It's a constraint. It is not a bonus.
Okay, but I'm not talking about sea level. I'm talking about above grade, above natural grade on
No,
the
it's
site.
40 foot above mean sea level.
No, at that location. But a
Well, the
house
grade is kind of
elsewhere
negative.
in the village is 32 feet above grade.
Yes.
Okay, so 32, I understand the distinction. But there is a built-in credit. Nobody's building a 5-foot house. I mean, I take your point on the example. But the reason I'm asking about this is because my impression was that there is an acknowledgement for beachfront homes that because their base flood level brings them up to a certain level where they begin, they are allowed to exceed a certain height above mean sea level, which they otherwise would not in the village. That is a correct statement, right?
No, it is not.
It's not, okay. So they can go to 40 feet above mean sea level.
Height is measured from base flood elevation. So if you were to put 32 feet on top of base flood elevation, that would be an apples for apples, giving you a bonus. What you're doing is say in a VE 17 and the 2 feet of freeboard is you're only allowing people 21 feet in which to build their house, including all floor levels and the roof structure. So you're winding up with like 8-foot high floors because you are constrained by the 40-foot above the sea level cap.
So they actually have lesser building envelope within the district in spite of the fact that they can come higher above sea level because of where they must begin. I got it.
Okay.
So,
That's an important clarification, though, that is relevant for all parties. So I just wanted to make that. So thank you.
okay. There was another point that you made that I thought I was going to address, but it's escaping just a moment. Okay. Oh, yeah. About raising the house.
Yes, the concept of flood proofing.
No. First of
versus
all, I don't think I
raising.
said flood proofing. There's no such thing as flood proofing. There's
Correct.
about flood mitigation, shall we say, design that I was referring to. But the point that was omitted from your side of that conversation was, as opposed to merely raising the house as is, in the particular case of 1145, if I recall, there were cathedral ceilings that didn't contain really necessary habitable space. And therefore, the house could have been raised and the ceilings lowered and maintaining substantially the same house.
I mean, I didn't get on to relitigate our case, but
I appreciate
you
that.
brought it up. That's actually not true at all. We don't have cathedral ceilings of empty space in our house. That is just a completely non-factual statement that we never had a chance to respond to.
All right, well, we're not relitigating, but in the spirit of what I was saying before about being fully informed, I do appreciate your input. Thank you.
And Lori, please put on your video and your sound. This is,
That was for both of us. Sorry about that.
okay.
And I just wanted to make a third point, which is, I think Mr. Mizell, you referenced going back to the Board of Trustees. And I think that as we see these cases proliferate and recognizing that we are a coastal community, I think it would behoove us to think these issues through and perhaps come up with a more robust set of guidelines, taking into account the chapters of the Sagaponic Code that talk about how there should be flexibility, while also recognizing that even flexibility should have limits within reason, and come up with a plan so that we're not stuck with a situation of homeowner after homeowner, and then some of them being thrown into the court system. And we might not like what the court system decides, either one of us. Better for us to think through these issues properly and what the boundaries and flexibilities should really be, recognizing that you as a zoning board have a lot of flexibility and room to maneuver within those guidelines, but perhaps it would help everyone to codify the flexibility beyond what we have, which is, hey, zoning boards should provide flexibility for flood relief. Let's all go in front of them. And if we don't like the answer, we wind up in the court system deciding. I just don't think that long-term or medium-term, that's in the best interest of the village. I think we should have a hearing where we go through this and come up maybe with a more robust set of guidelines that everyone can adhere to, rather than having a discretionary case-by-case, possibly litigated in the courts afterwards system. I think that's burying our head in the sand.
I think you're saying much the same of what I was saying before, and that is the Zoning Board of Appeals does not have original jurisdiction to write the code or amend the code. We have the ability to hear appeals from the application of the existing code. I think this kind of discussion, even though it may not even be germane to this particular application, is very helpful, as it may be informative in the event that the village does decide that the code bears amendment, having heard the number of applications that we're getting here at the ZBA on an ad hoc basis. So I let you go on, and actually you clarified something for me about the 40-foot elevation not necessarily being a benefit or a credit, which I think is an important point. Zoning districts are created in order to accommodate certain requirements of zoning areas within a village, in order to maintain the unique features and the attractive features of those areas within the village. And the beachfront is clearly an area that has unique situations with dunes, wetlands, coastal erosion zones, etc., narrow properties with little frontage between the access roads and the limits of where they can build, and the narrowness of the parcels. So perhaps it would be worthwhile to revisit the code sections that pertain to those areas, but it's not something that the ZBA can do. We can only hear particular cases, and by doing so, perhaps better inform the trustees or a commission, zoning commission, if that's what it is, that would consider revising the code in order to accommodate those needs. So I'm pleased. I think this has been very useful. As I said, I thought the CARP presentation that we produced, it's all very useful information, but we're taking a lot of time. We do have another application. So I want to come back to this application. We did have another question from someone.
No, that actually was Mrs.
Oh, okay. Yeah, then Mr. Jackson, you want to speak?
Actually, the conversation touched on many of the things I thought I'd bring up, but I might as well go down the list if I can read my status.
Just
First of all,
introduce
you
yourself
talk-
again, please.
I'm sorry.
Introduce
Oh, I'm
yourself.
sorry. Leonard Jackson, professional engineer, the principal of Leonard Jackson Associates Consulting Engineer. And by the way, I think last time I mentioned, I was a FEMA consultant for 35 years, and I prepared many of the maps in New York State, and maybe some more out of it. I'm speaking on behalf of the applicant, not FEMA. But there's a lot of discussion about FEMA compliant and so forth, and it should be clear that FEMA promulgates regulations that the village has adopted. When you talk about FEMA compliance, it's really compliance with village regulations, village zoning. FEMA doesn't really come in and evaluate these things. You must. FEMA comes in and evaluates the village to make sure the village is doing what you're supposed to do. So now what happens is, apparently, and what I've heard is your code has a built-in catch, and it has to do with elevations. And I'm not sure that the elevations that the code states has accommodated the fact that the elevations, the base flood elevation, which is the top of the wave, keeps changing. In 2009, I think was the first time, I believe, I think the structure that we're talking about was built before that. But that number has raised now to, I think it's 17 now. And so as these things change, well, your code is now really obsolete. It doesn't really accommodate these things. And you should consider that. Somebody mentioned that, yes, in some areas, depending on where you are, you may wind up with, you want to conform with your code. If you combine the pyramid rule, and I should review it here, the pyramid rule and the maximum height, you may wind up in a little triangular shaped building that's sitting on piles. It doesn't work. So yes, you should look at your code and make sure that it accommodates these new FEMA flood elevations. The other thing that was discussed was, when must you comply with your regulations for compliance with these elevations and B zones and so forth? And the answer is when you increase the value of a structure, not the property. I think the building inspection meant that. It says the value of the building, the construction of the building. If that value goes up by more than 50% to construct a structure, then you must redo the building to comply with your code and elevate it. There's a lot of discussion about it. So the applicant changed their mind. I see that all the time. I did a job in Yonkers. We needed a variance to do flood walls and so forth to protect the 10 multi-story buildings from flooding. They had been flooding for 30 years. And the neighbors said, no, these walls would be unsightly, and they opposed it. Variances were granted. We built the thing in Hurricane Ida. Fortunately, these buildings were protected, but the neighbors who complained were not. And so they called me and they hired me to do the same thing for them that I did for the people. And so they, of course, they change your mind. When you see what happens during a flood, your mind changes. In this particular instance, I can't stress enough because I've seen it so many times. If and when this event occurs, and it may, this house could be destroyed. And when you consider all the other, whether it's environmental view shed, what's the real effect on the neighboring properties? Is it really so terrible if it goes up a couple of feet? The answer is, the overriding consideration is, if they don't raise the house, it will be destroyed in the next flood.
It's not a choice between raising the house or not raising the house. It's a question of raising the house with some sensitivity to the current.
And I fully understand, but because I've seen it so many times, I look at it this as, what are the overriding concerns here? On this hand, with the consideration of views and so forth, on the other hand, the house will be destroyed. I'm sure you could raise the house and chop off some of it. It depends on, then you get into how much does it cost? I've heard there's a bedroom up there and so forth. Yes, what does it cost to chop off this bedroom? I don't know. But those are the considerations. But the bottom line is, we really want to see this thing destroyed in the next flood. It's as simple as that. If you have any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Mika, you want to respond?
Yes. Since the architect is available on the Zoom, I thought it would be important for the record for us to know how many stops this elevator is going to make. Perhaps the architect could tell us that.
In the studio.
It would make 4 stops.
Yeah, that's
So
what I.
who spoke that?
That's
Mika,
Andres.
what if the fourth stop is to a roof? A bulkhead? Does that count as a
Like a
story?
roof deck?
Say they put it up and.
Well, the number of stops.
We can't hear you, Andres.
I'm here.
Okay,
You say it makes 4 stops. What are those 4 stops?
It would be the ground floor, the first floor, the main floor, and the master bedroom level. But the master bedroom level is enclosed with the elevator overrun and the lobby. And that volume existed prior to any previous renovation that was done.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to make clear that I'm not suggesting that the board is stopped from making an individualized decision on this application. I do think it is unseemly for for a party to come in and do a 180-degree turnaround. I think if there's an equitable element there that you understand. However, I don't think that the applicant has shown why its height variance for 52 feet for raising an existing house should be granted when the height variance for 51 feet for raising an existing house at 1145 Sag Main was denied. What about this application makes it different so that the board should come to a different conclusion? And that has not been addressed at all. Finally, I'd just like to point out that as designed, as proposed, and I mentioned this in the brief, there's a master bedroom deck that would directly overlook my client's house, and I believe it's at 42 feet, if I'm not mistaken, it's either 40 or 42 feet. My clients also proposed, a deck off of their daughter's bedroom and their own primary bedroom. That deck, because their house is effectively a two stories of habitable space, would be at 30 feet. So really there's a very serious privacy concern that's raised by what's proposed here. And I think that is something that this board is here to consider. And you'd have, as Ms. Foster said, you already have the tallest house, now you would have a substantially taller house. Would have a very significant privacy impact on my client's property and other properties to have the deck at that height. Thank you very much.
We also have one more neighbor that would like to speak. Ms. Buck, please turn on your video and your sound. Deborah Buck.
Yep. Hi, I'm here. It says unable to start video. But I'm happy to speak without my video on.
Okay.
I don't know why it won't do that. Anyway, so I'm Deborah Buck, owner of 43 Sand Dune Court. Obviously, I've been looking at this house. Start my video. There we go. Okay. Hi. I'm very familiar with this house. I think that it's very important to, as we're talking about community and we're talking about the impacts, that there is truly an aesthetic impact to raising this house and the way it is being raised. I would like to know if the cobalt blue fiberglass cladding is going to continue in the house when it's raised. I think that everyone who sees this house understands that the cobalt blue fiberglass cladding reads as sort of a plastic element, whereas the rest of the community has used cedar, which weathers and kind of blends in to the skyscape, the landscape. We think about dark sky, we think about all these things, but I think that that is something that should be asked of the owners, that perhaps if they are going to raise it, they not do it with that really loud blue. And I think that the other comments, which I'm just really saying as someone who will be impacted visually every day as I am now by this house, and even more visually impacted, that I will lose sky, ocean, in my view, that aesthetics be considered in doing this, as well as all the other things that other people have said, like privacy, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think that this has been a very thoughtful consideration of how to make this house safer, but visually easier and more attractive to all the residents of Sagaponack, including the people who just visit the beach on a daily basis, as Mary Lee was saying. So thank you. That's what I had to say.
Thank you.
I'll be quick. We made this point, but I think it bears repeating because there's a lot of discussion about the height of the structure, which is the 51 9 inch. this is the area that's at 51.9, that small portion. So this discussion, the whole structure isn't going up to 51.9, only that part that's in that green. That, I think, undermines the neighbor's privacy argument, but it occurs to me that that house isn't built yet. So if there's concerns about privacy, why doesn't it shift away from the property line? That's the easy answer to that. As far as Ms. Buck's comments and a lot of the comments that we're hearing is it's really disturbing that we're raising aesthetics over safety. You've heard from our FEMA consultant. I've provided you with the studies. You've seen the devastation in Florida. It is really a safety issue, and I don't think aesthetics should be raised over safety. We're going to take a look at the issue with moving the master suite, if you will. I think that's going to be a big problem, putting it over a garage with breakaway walls. I think there's some significant engineering issues there. I think there are probably some environmental issues as well, but we'll take a look at it and we'll foreclose that issue for you.
I suggest you take a broader look at other locations, not merely over the garage.
Can I just ask one
Sure.
more quick question? Okay, so I just understood what you said there about this, the overrun is 51. But in this drawing that we have here, which is the same as the one below, 40 feet is the top of where the blue is.
That's correct. So most of the structure's at 47. And it's
Okay.
the overrun that goes up.
Right, to 51.
And Marilee, the town allowed 2 foot above the 40-foot level
Mhm,
to take into account the freeboard. We
mhm,
do not.
mhm,
So that's why that house currently existing that was built legally
mhm.
is already 2 feet above where we.
Freeboard,
Freeboard is a measurement from base flood elevation to where you have to start either the bottom of your first framing member in an AE zone, or to the top of the floor in your AE zone, or to the bottom of the first framing member in the VE zone. It's an additional 2 feet with a flood protection that's part of the requirement.
All right, anybody else have any comments or questions? And no one else on Zoom. All right, so I said that I thought we should hold the hearing open for at least written submissions in view of the material that was just submitted today. Do you think that we need to have another hearing?
We do have,
Oh, we have another comment?
yes.
Okay, well, I'll come to the comment in a moment, but as long as I've asked the question as to whether we should.
well,
or we-
weren't you asking him to reconsider some of the
Yeah,
designs?
yeah, I
So
think-
you
I
usually-
think-
I feel like we need to
I
leave
think
it
we
open
need
if
to
that's
keep-
going to
okay.
take place.
All right,
To see
I
if
agree.
they could put it somewhere else.
I agree. I think it's going to require another hearing, so we will, but first we'll hear from the person who raised their hand here.
Yes, Ms. Siegel, please unmute yourself.
Still muted,
She's still
So that we
muted.
could hear you.
lower left-hand side. There's a microphone with a line through it. If you click on that, you will unmute.
Maybe she's having technical.
All right.
Let me see if I can
Can you unmute it from there?
get unmute everybody.
Oh.
It's not-
Lori, do you have a button at the lower left, probably on your screen, with a picture of the microphone and a red line through it? Can you click on that? No. Not even, okay. We're gonna move on. If you are able to unmute, we'll come back to you. All right, so for the moment, since there were no other comments on this and we are going to continue the hearing, I will entertain a motion to continue the hearing to the December meeting, which will be held. Now, there are no other elements of new business, but the December meeting is December 9th at 3 p.m. here at the Village Hall, both for written and oral testimony and submissions. And the written submissions, let's say at least a week before the hearing that we get them. And it's not intended that there be a colloquy back and forth with a submission and then a reply. Let's have them come in at the same time, please. Because you will have an opportunity then to speak at the meeting. So if something that you read after having already submitted your papers, you'll have an opportunity to address it at the meeting. So I'd like the written submissions by December 1st, and the hearing will continue to December 9th. Anybody? I'll make that motion. All in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Now, we will move to the second application of the day. Sorry. Anybody want to take a little break before we do that? Appreciate the clarification. I was reading it wrong.
And with the way the FEMA elements, it's zone,
Yeah, I'm thinking if people elevate their homes, they should keep them on molly columns with jacks. So as the FEMA levels raise, they can raise the house up.
The Jetsons did that to get the house thing above the weather.
I can't wait for the words. So one of the things with this application is here, for one thing, it's very small, right? But is this what we're calling the base elevation?
Well, this is great. So
Great,
then you have-
okay,
So then
okay.
you have an imaginary point that FEMA thinks the water will come up to,
And-
that's
and-
called base flood.
And they're
elevation.
saying that's that right there.
Yes.
Okay.
So now, because this is in a velocity zone, you have to have 2 feet on top of that to the bottom of your first framing limit. So from what you're looking at from your base to the
Usually
bottom
2
of your
feet
floor
third.
joist, that's where you have to meet that 19 level.
Okay, so this basement, this has to start at 19.
Yes.
And there has to be 2 feet, so that you're immediately starting at 21.
Yes.
Okay.
And basically.
Why does it have to be 2 feet?
Because that's what FEMA describes. They just talk about-
Additional safety margin.
Yeah.
But then why didn't they just make it 21 feet?
Well, did you ever see this as Final Town? His amp goes to 11.
I didn't ever. I shouldn't ask that question because.
Well,
it's really important.
I do remember that. This one goes to 11.
All right. Are we waiting for anybody to return? Or are we? able to
No, I
start?
think we're good.
We're good? Okay. Yeah, all right, so sorry. This is also an item of old business. It's One Sweet Potato LLC at 1 Potato Road, application 3 of 2022. We heard testimony and received submissions last month, and this hearing has been continued. And Anthony Pasca for the applicant.
Yes, sir. I exhausted myself last time, so, but you guys wanted to take a month to deliberate, think about it.
So you're here to answer.
I don't actually, I don't have anything further to add.
Mhm.
I found the last hearing kind of interesting and I'm happy to talk about that offline someday, but
Yeah,
as far as my application goes, I have nothing new to add there. I don't believe there were any neighbor opposition letters submitted in the last month.
there's no
So,
opposition, right?
I don't really have anything to respond to other than
All right.
to answer your questions.
Again, these are not adversarial proceedings between applicants and opponents, but they are a dialogue which is very helpful to the board to evaluate the issues and render an appropriate decision. So even in the absence of someone opposing the application, some of the same issues come up here on your application that we've just been addressing at some length. a number of the variances that you're seeking, there were 9 variances if I recall. I mean, they're relatively innocuous and I don't think we need to discuss them. The height clearly is one that we focused a lot on. This one would be a building height of 45 feet 5 inches.
Correct.
The one that was just before us was for the main structure 47 and going up with the elevator to 51. The one at 1145 Sag Main, and we're going to be getting others there. So this is really a thorny issue, whether or not there's any opposition to the particular application, and it's a difficult decision for us to make. So the house is, again, a house that's an existing house that would be just elevated. I mean, it's going to be extended and expanded upon, but the existing structure is going to be elevated, and it's got a sloped roof. And the height of the roof at the lower level of the ceiling already on the second floor is at basically close to a compliant level anyway.
Close, yeah.
Yeah,
Maybe a
and
foot off.
a substantial portion of that exceeds about 3 feet of the 5 feet is probably just due to the roof angle that admittedly creates a nice open space in that living area. Any consideration to perhaps somehow leveling off that roof at a certain point so it doesn't just?
Yeah, I did ask that question.
Yeah.
And it really would kind of fundamentally alter the project because there's no intent to do a structural change to that portion of the building, which is in particular really the best room in the house right now. And they might change the membrane on the roof, but they're not stripping the structural portion of the roof out. So it kind of takes it to a different project and it's very different expense to do it. And I heard you talk about expense, but
The additional 2 feet of illumination that is up at the top of where that slope ceiling is more than compensated by lifting the entire structure the 5 feet, right? So you're gonna have as much view out over the ocean
no, I
without as high a ceiling.
totally understand that. But it does change the nature of the renovation from, basically being cosmetic changes and
In that room.
altering, the roof.
No, it's going to add to the alteration in that room, but it's a substantial alteration. You're adding additional bedrooms and additional space. It's going to be a more massive renovation.
That's true.
It's just that particular room wasn't being
At
addressed.
that particular, the roof structure itself was not intended to be changed other than the extension. I guess a couple of points then to maybe distinguish this from the other application. I know I don't remember the number, 1145 Sag Main, and then the Lutnick application, the common feature there is that it is a voluntary lift. Like there's no,
Right.
they could just choose not to do it and it wouldn't change anything other than the lift itself. We are at a point where we can't legally do the renovations that we want to do, the addition in the front, without doing the lift at the same time. It's just a legal requirement. We break that substantial, you talked about the substantial modification requirement. We are going to break that in spades because there's just no way to do the front addition without breaking that number. So, I suppose there's 3 different categories that you guys have been looking at. One is the completely new construction, like the Petrillo case. The other is the 1145 and the Lutnick application, which is just a lift. And then there's probably more often there's going to be the in-betweens like our project where you have a combination of renovations that then is coupled with a lift because the second you do the renovations, you're required to do the lift. I think maybe the only other point I'll say is in a small village like this, in the town of Southampton, they have more black and white rules. And they do have an allowance to lift the house above the 40-foot mark, period. If you're just taking an existing house, if Lutnick House was in the town of Southampton, she'd get to do that.
There's no limitation.
No limitation, as long as it's just lifting the existing house. Additions have to comply with the 40-foot rule. in a small village, I kind of understand why the trustees would say, you know what? There's not that many of these that we can't have them looked at on a case-by-case basis. And you look at the impacts on the neighbors and you look at the, you know, factor in all the factors, that you have 5 factors and you're all capable of creating that balance and coming to a right determination on your set of facts.
Well, I do appreciate that there is a smaller number of homes and we may not be burdened daily with applications, maybe 40 or 50 houses altogether, and they won't all be applying. Some of them are already compliant. But apart from the burden on the board, we are going to be burdened by each one of the variances that we grant the next time another one comes before us, the prior ones being cited as precedential, which is already happening. Now you're at 45 feet, which is sort of halfway between the 2 feet that was granted to the Petrellos, and well, it's even more, but it's 47 feet for the structure if you ignore the elevator bulkhead for the Lutnick application was just here. So I guess by being somewhere in the middle, you're not one of the extremes that we would be bound by.
Yeah, and I'll also just on our own behalf add as another mitigating factor, the fact that it is a pitched roof.
Yeah.
Means that the bulk of the roof, if you want to take an average of where it is,
Yeah.
it's not 45.5 straight across where the entire, you know, there's a 5-foot piercing across the entire plane. Half the house is basically compliant.
And it's the
41.
seaward side, which is furthest away from other structures.
It's just the ridge that hits that 45.5 at the back end. And we even trimmed off a little bit of the overhang to try to bring it back a little. That probably cut a couple of inches off of the.
May I ask a question about the design? I'm looking at the west, I'm looking at the west elevation. So on the floor, and I understand you're lifting the entire house. So how, these look like floor to ceiling, all glass, I'm guessing. How high are these ceilings? In like, so if you're on the ocean side, is it 13 feet of glass
in the
looking out
very
over the
back,
ocean?
At the highest
At the
elevation.
very peak of the back, we determined that last time when we crunched the numbers, that it was 13 feet.
So this area here is looking
And
out
the
over the
seaward,
ocean.
at the seaward side.
Right, so how, and that's 13 feet?
Yeah. And back here, at the very rear, it's only
What's
like,
here?
yeah, here, it's only a matter of 8 foot, 8'6" or something. ceiling height.
No, it's 10.
No, I don't think so.
Well, this is
Very-
30 feet and then here's
Oh,
40.
okay, so maybe it is 10 feet. But I think the inside space, perhaps because of the roof,
Yeah.
it wasn't even a full 10 feet. But it slopes up to the 13, correct, at the extreme south edge.
That's correct.
And that was my point about perhaps leveling it off at a point to diminish the maximum encroachment, which adds materially to the.
Yeah, I did inquire about that.
Yeah,
after the
no,
last
you said
meeting.
you required, so I appreciate you at least exploring that. But it is the area of the house which is furthest away
It's
from
this
other
piece right here.
structures. Now, there's a house to the west, the big house to the west, which is already, you told us the elevation of that house. That's what you remember.
Two over?
Yeah,
Yeah, that met the one that's 2 over was new construction. They were able
Oh,
to
that's right.
squeeze that into,
but there's another one that was higher than I think.
yeah, that's I think 3 or 4 over.
And that one's at 47, I believe. Here's the,
It's 3 over.
But there is another house somewhere on Sand Dune.
There is, and
I mean,
it's-
on Potato Lane.
It's
47.4 is that analysis.
We had pulled that from the, I think it was the 25 Potato Road application. They had done a height analysis. And 35 Potato Road is at 47.4, and they're not in the FEMA zone. That's just straight, you know, bottom to top is at the 47.4 mark. And probably the only other one that's going to be affected is the 11 Potato next door, which someday, they're not FEMA compliant today, but someday they aren't in the FEMA zone like we are. They may be dealing with a similar problem, so.
It's sort of a remarkable modification of the FEMA zone just to the west of that house, where it zips up behind just those two houses.
Yep, it goes right up Potato Road basically, and then comes back down again. And I think I pointed out the last time, this was the house that fell in the ocean. So not this house, but the predecessor house was the one that fell in the ocean in the 90s.
Okay. Any questions? Anybody on Zoom?
No,
All right, we prepared to close the hearing on this application? Yes, all right, I'll entertain a motion then to close the hearing on the application of 1 Potato Road. Second?
No.
No, you don't want to close this application? You want more testimony?
There's
You want
just,
more
there's
submission?
nothing that can really,
We're not rendering a decision.
I get that, but, well, but we will be, because we're closing a hearing.
We'll
and I
have
just-
60 days
yeah,
to do that.
yeah.
In 62 days.
Yeah, I just think that these are really thorny issues. and
Well, we can discuss it now. The question is whether.
We're not going to get any further because he's got what's here and made clear that they're lifting a house, so there's really, because they're lifting the existing house, so there's no modification that can be made to the existing roof line, short of not going for the complete FEMA compliance to make this house
Oh, no, he didn't say.
compliant.
He said that they investigated chopping some of the lift off by leveling off the roof at a height so that it would not encroach. They cut off an extension of the roof, an overhang,
Yeah,
which dropped a few inches. They say that it would be a substantial additional renovation cost and intrusion on the existing structure to further modify that roof line. So they did consider the alternative and they rejected it. And you are now in a position to decide whether that was reasonable or not reasonable. The question really for us is whether there's a point to keeping the hearing open, whether we will obtain by so doing either further information or further modification of the plans that would enable us to render a decision. If so, then we can keep the hearing open, but for a specific purpose. If not, then we can close the hearing and we have time to then mull this over and render a decision. Do you think there is a benefit to keeping the hearing open for a specific purpose, to hear whether there would be a further modification of the plan or to get further written submission?
I think not.
Do you want to comment on that? No.
I don't have anything else to add unless there are any
Well, so
outstanding questions.
in light of that and what not having anything to add is by assent, seemingly that there is no further modification of the plan that would be forthcoming if we were to keep the hearing open. I don't really see any point in keeping the hearing open. I think we should close the hearing and then render a decision on the application as made. I'm not forcing you to make.
I know. Luckily, you guys could vote without me and still close the hearing.
Well, okay, you can abstain if you wish, I mean, but I just was trying to
No, I understand.
say.
I understand. I don't think
If you think there is some benefit.
I wish there was.
The only benefit would appear to be to give us more time to mull it over. I don't think that we're going to have any more information to enable us to do a better job if we close the hearing today. Okay, so I will again entertain a motion to close the hearing on this application. Do I hear a second?
Aye.
All in favor? You want to abstain?
Yeah.
Okay, so there are four votes to close the hearing on the next motion. Thank you very much. Okay, there being no further business before the board tonight, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
I'll make that motion.
You redeem yourself. Second, all in favor? Aye, thanks very much. Okay, pretty interesting today. What do you think, Chris?
You're drawing a good line. sweet potato.